All right. Okay, well, first of all, thank you for joining us today. We've got our webinar with Mara Leveritt, Making a Reporter, and she'll be sharing her investigative tips for investigating a crime is what we'll specifically be chatting about today, but we'll have Q&A at the end for other questions as well that you might have for Mara. Yeah, so Mara is one of the 12 journalists that we profiled in our book that I wrote. This is Stephanie Forshee, by the way. I wrote the book with my friend and former colleague, Rosie Downey, in Other News, Reporters on Reporting. And Mara is one of the people that we profiled, and she was generous enough to give us her time to share her experience as a reporter and some of her career highlights, and we'll be going through a little bit of that today. And I'll just give a little introduction of Mara, and then I'll pass it all over to her to get started. Mara Leveritt, of course, is an incredible reporter and author, and we're very lucky to have her with us today. As I mentioned, she's based in Little Rock, Arkansas, where she spent many years doing great journalism, and much of her time has actually been dedicated to investigative crime reporting. She's best known for her coverage of the West Memphis 3 case, which she has reported on for more than 20 years. She wrote a book about those murders called Devil's Knot, and there is now a film starring Reese Witherspoon and Colin Firth based on that reporting. She's written 2 other books, The Boys on the Tracks and her latest, Dark Spell, which she co-authored with one of the men involved with the West Memphis 3 case, Jason Baldwin. She now works as a contributing editor of the Arkansas Times and is writing yet another book, which I hope will be a great success. It's about CIA drug smuggler Barry Seal, and I'm sure hopefully she can share some details with us about that as well later in the webinar during questions. I know she has a big deadline coming up for that book, so thank you, Mara, for your time. We really appreciate it. So without much further ado.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Stephanie. That was a quick recap and very nice. I'm glad to do this with you, and I'm congratulate you and Rosie on a very good idea in producing in Other News and in interviewing reporters, because most of us are so scattered around, and it's not too often that we get to get insights like the ones that you've collected about how reporters figure out their own way in the jobs that they do. So I was hoping that maybe with this webinar we could look at that a little bit more closely. So,
yes. Thank you.
What would you like me to tell first about a little bit about the book I did in particular, Devil's Knot, the West Memphis case, and then maybe go on to some of the facets of how we decide to take on a job that potentially can take years, or in the case of a couple books that I've written, decades to produce. That's kind of what I was thinking of doing. Is that okay?
Yep, that is perfect. Yeah, if we can just get a little, for those of us who aren't very familiar with the West Memphis 3 case, just a brief overview of that, and then kind of how you went about the case, that'd be great.
Okay. In 1993, 3 8-year-old boys were found murdered in the eastern Arkansas town of West Memphis, just across the Mississippi River from Memphis, Tennessee. In short order, 3 teenagers in the area were accused of committing the murders. There was no physical evidence connecting the teenagers to the murders, but police said that it was a satanic crime, that the motive was that the teenagers had gotten involved in Satanism, and that the murders were committed as part of an occult ritual. And when the boys were brought to trial, they were one of the witnesses against them was a so-called expert in the occult, and the lawyers for the guys challenged them and that expert and said, we don't think that there's such a thing as an expert in the occult. And the judge said, because he didn't have any qualifying degrees or anything, and as a friend of mine who teaches at the law school here said, what would be that, something like a Ghostbuster or something. But the judge allowed him to testify as an expert, and that man testified that there were all kinds of things, the fact that there were 3 victims, the fact that there were 3 killers, the fact that there was a full moon that night, the fact that there was blood involved in the murders, what do you know, and the fact that they were found near water, which everybody knows is a big thing. He put all that together and said that these were indeed occult murders. 2 juries, there were 2 trials, and I should add that one of the boys, these kids were 16, 17, and 18 years old. The 17-year-old was considered mentally slow. He'd been in special education all of his life until he dropped out of high school, and he was pressured for a long time in questioning by the police, and he had finally, after saying no, he didn't have any involvement at all, he finally had come around to not only saying that the other 2 had done it, but adding that he had participated as well. So, and then he expected to be let go by the police because he thought that he told them what they wanted. But it all, of course, went the other way, and all 3 of them were tried and ultimately convicted. The oldest boy, 18-year-old Damien Eccles, was sentenced to death, and the other 2 to life in prison. So I got involved when I was a reporter and had not even attended the trials. But when I heard of the convictions and I scoured the reporting of them, I could not find what evidence had led to the jury's conclusions. And that piqued my interest. I went to the West Memphis Police Department as soon as the convictions were in, the police records became open, and I was taken back to a sloppy mess of a room, about 4 by 4, big closet actually, where they had just stacks of boxes and stuff all over the place, and that was their police file on the case. And I spent a couple days going through that, and that's where I first read the transcript of the questioning. The questioning of the 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly had taken hours, close, at least 6 hours, maybe as long as 8. But only 2 sections of that were recorded and transcribed. But even what I saw in those 2 transcribed portions really shocked me, that the police and prosecutors in particular would have gone ahead and charged these guys based on those statements. So that was the beginning. I was writing a column as well as regular reporting at the time. I wrote a column at that time, it was around Halloween of 1993. The murders were in May, and so now we're in about October. I've done a few reports on what people were thinking about as the trials went on and so forth. But then I wrote a column saying that I thought, having seen that transcript, it was about the scariest thing I'd ever seen, and that was the scariest Halloween column I could write. But from then on, I followed the case for. I went and visited Damien Eccles on Row, and continued to meet with over the years with all of the men repeatedly in prison, got to know them, and ultimately in about 15 years after the murders, I wrote the book Devil's Knot. Actually, I was close to 20 years after the let me see. Yeah, close to 20 years after the murder, I wrote Devil's Knot, and so it was a lot of investigating and going through the transcripts of the trials and looking super close at everything that had gone on in that time. And I would add, HBO had made a documentary at the trials, filmed the trials, which was extraordinary, and that was a big deal too. So in all the world, really, it was HBO, the two really good, excellent filmmakers who made the Paradise Lost series on the crime, and me. We were the ones who were thinking that there was a lot more here to talk about than the state of Arkansas had concluded, and in fact, it still considers those guys guilty, even though it has let them go.
Okay, well, I know that is something, I mean, of interest. I know that you've been covering this for many years, but that's something that comes up a lot, I would think, is, you know, I see that there is this case, there's this crime that's been committed, and some of the things don't add up, but I mean, is this something that I'm going to be able to pursue as a reporter? And I think you've got some tips for us there. If you, if you could enlighten us today on, I guess, kind of your decision to pursue this and kind of what your tips are just for any case in general. What would warrant your time, I guess, for reporting?
Yeah. Okay. So as I said, the very decision to whether this is something that you want to invest more time in is something that every reporter has to take on. Editors usually start
Mara?
an initiative. You're looking around for what matters in you become your own editor, and make that critical assignment to yourself. And how you do that, I think, of course, is takes into account all of the things that you've learned about what makes news, what is important and what isn't, and so forth, the things that all media try to weigh in various ways. But for me, the guiding principle has been kind of a sniff test, a smelling. Does this smell right? Do the dots connect? Is there something that is off about this story? And I'm not interested in crime per se. I do criminal justice, and it's called crime reporting, and sometimes my books are usually in the true crime section of stores and libraries, but that it's not the awful things that bad guys do to each other that particularly interest me. Where my interest goes happens to be to when the government is involved, when police and officials are involved, and what they're doing smells in some way to me, because I think we expect them to be doing right, and it's the media, it's the press, it's why we've got the First Amendment, is for the press to be keeping an especially close eye on that. So for me, that's what I want to be looking at, is government. And when the government sentences somebody to death, particularly, or to life in prison, or as Jason Baldwin, the youngest of the three defendants, would have said, to 5 minutes in prison, then that's to be paid attention to, especially if they're doing it wrongly. So if the public cannot understand why that's happened, and I consider myself the public, if I can not understand how this came about. That's my assignment right there. I'm going to track it down until I satisfy myself. I'm either going to understand it or I'm not. And if I understand it, bravo. Everybody's doing their job. That's great. I'm really pleased. If I don't understand it, I'm going further. And the more serious the episode, the more seriously I go forward. So the decision to look closer, I think, is based on what piques your interest and what's worth your time, and what would you feel bad about if you turned away? What would always kind of tug at you and say, oh, I shouldn't have done that? And I've got one of those in my past. I remember being told many, many years ago about a chemically contaminated site here in Arkansas by a chemist, by somebody who knew. And it was just a social occasion, and he mentioned it was there. And I just didn't know enough about chemistry, and it just sounded daunting, and I didn't know where to begin, and I just didn't look any further. And then it turned into be a very, very, very big, awful story. But you can't do everything, so I've done what I can. So I'd say the decision to look closer is one thing. Then the decision to pursue. Okay, so now you decided this is a big, awful, bad thing, or looks like it anyway. The question next becomes is really, practically speaking, can you get at it? I've got files and files from people's family, people in prison and their families. Mara, investigate this. Somebody's got to look at that. So, there are so many people in prison, and as DNA has shown us,
Oh, we've just lost your audio, Mara.
how bad this is that happened to me, I won't be in prison for the rest of my life or even put to death. But the fact is that just like the Innocence Project can't take every letter it gets, no reporter can do that either. And so the next thing for me has been to weigh what are the practical possibilities of me getting deeper into this. In my first book, which was about two boys who were murdered in another part of Arkansas, it turned out that the mother of one of the victims was a meticulous record keeper, and she had turned her dead son's bedroom into an archive of records of her attempts to get some actual information about the case, in much the way that we're seeing people around the country now trying to get police video of shootings. So this mother, long ago, had done that in her way, and I remember thinking, oh my gosh, there is really something to work with here. Plus, she was an intelligent, is an intelligent woman. I found her straightforward. I kind of ran through my little litany of tests about, are you going to be crossing up your stories? And she was consistent, and she was clear, and she agreed to speak with me on the record. So with all that, then I was able to go ahead and I wrote my first book on that case. In the second case, and that was a hard book because the case was never solved, there was never a trial. And so the publishers, that was St. Martin's Press, made me jump through months of hoops of proving that they were not going to end up with libel lawsuits. The second one was when Simon & Schuster published Devil's Knot. I had the great advantage of that there had been 2 trials. So transcripts, those court records were invaluable and made my life a lot easier in a lot of ways. But I was also taking the position that the transcripts, a lot of error had crept into those trials. So what was I going to do about that? And in that situation, I had the good fortune of, and I'll say this was from my good old-fashioned legwork of talking to a lot of people. And one of the people I talked to was a private investigator in Memphis who had signed on as a volunteer to assist in the defense. And unlike the West Memphis police, he did keep records, and they were beautifully organized. Binders, rows and rows in a really good office. He made those available to me, and I, with his help and the transcripts and then the interviews, I knew I was able to go on to that, so that I could do it. And that's an important thing. You can't do what you can't do. So the decision to pursue and knowing that you've got a means is important. I think the third thing I'd say is the decision that you have to consider that you may have to let go. You've invested a lot, and you have come to a point of view about the story, and you're rolling, and then, whoa, something comes along, and it makes you question your premises, and maybe not just question them, maybe you find out that you're flat wrong. Maybe the original theory of the police was flat wrong, but what you've been thinking is also wrong, because there are always so many possibilities. So being willing to say, if not, I'm going to abandon this, say, I've got to look at this in an entirely different way, and do that. And that keeps you honest, that keeps you straight, I think, and if you were approaching your work with that kind of openness, it gives it integrity. And if not, you just become PR for your own point of view, which is worthless.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, so that I would say is 3. Then the decision to stand apart. What does that mean? For me, that means that, as I said, in the case of the West Memphis murders, there were filmmakers from HBO who had done extraordinary work in getting access to the trials, and in as far as reporting about the case in Arkansas and reporting skeptically, even after the convictions, there was me. I was it here, and the rest of the media and the Arkansas Supreme Court had by then unanimously affirmed all the convictions. So it was the full weight of civil authority and my peers, basically, in media saying, well, we think that they did it. And me saying, there are too many questions. Fortunately, when the HBO films came out, first film came out, it was just about at the beginning of the internet era, and that film, Paradise Lost, created quite a lot of interest among a lot of people who were not in Arkansas, but who were as appalled as I was. And they started talking, and groups formed, and a lot of outside pressure began to form on Arkansas. But still, everybody in Arkansas was, especially the West Memphis police, were saying, well, those are just outside kooks and nuts who don't know what they're talking about. And because they weren't here, we were here, we know. And I was the voice in Arkansas saying, I'm here too. I have examined this very, very closely, and I'm saying there are some strong questions. So that standing apart, I mean, I remember one of my very close friends who had some access to some of the people in West Memphis, and she told me that they know, Mara, they know that there is evidence that didn't make it into trial that these guys did it. And that rumor was being put forth by police. It was being put forth by the Arkansas Attorney's Office. That rumor was profound. Now, it doesn't make any sense. If there was that kind of evidence, why in the world was it not presented at trial? It didn't matter. That rumor that there was conclusive evidence, it just didn't get into the trial, that held the day for almost 20 years around here. And so just to kind of stand back and say, okay, well, I know you think that, but I've looked closely and I've looked at everything. I've touched, and I'd gone by then and I'd touched the clothes the boys that were retrieved from the things that were retrieved from the murder site, things I shouldn't have even been allowed to touch at the time. Wow. But at any rate, so I did know, I did feel I was on solid ground, especially as now years and years are going by about this. So there was that. Then related to that, the decision to trust your good sense. Here in this case, and it would have been the same if I'd gone into, say, that chemical spill case, where in that case I'm certainly not trained as a chemist, and that was daunting to me. I didn't think I could handle the level of science that I would need to go into that case. With law, even though I'm not trained as a lawyer, I did think, perhaps arrogantly, but I did think that at least the public should be able to understand what's going on in the courts. You shouldn't have to be a lawyer to understand how this happened. And if a clear telling of this evidence led to that conclusion, led the jury to think, and if there's some things that are stretches, and the jury may have to weigh, and you leave it. They were there, they heard it. You give it to them. But when it's really grotesque, as I thought this was, then the idea that even though I'm not a lawyer, I should be able to read a transcript. I should be able to read the law and understand. So in that case, I turned repeatedly to good lawyers. I knew by then I'd met the attorneys who were representing these guys, and let me tell you, these were some astonishingly wonderful lawyers, very dedicated, really great, and I got to basically learn a lot from some of the best legal minds in the country, and if I had a good question, they took the time to answer me. And I think realizing that if you've done your work and people are ready to, you can demonstrate that by the quality of your question, then busy people who are working very hard on a lot of things will take the time to answer your question. And I've been very grateful for that and been helped enormously by it, and it's given me the confidence to go ahead and write. So there's that. And then, but at the same time, I still had to run into members of the Arkansas Supreme Court here and members of the Arkansas Bar who kind of would say, who the hell are you? Who do you think you are to have questioned all this? And that still happens. But the fact is that the world has changed. It's done a flip on this case, and the state of Arkansas is in this ridiculous position right now of having released these 3 guys from prison, even though it continues to say they are mass killers. So, or multiple killers, I guess. So anyway, and then the final thing I would say is that in order to do this, you've got to have something fueling you. You've got to have some kind of sense of proportion and relevance that is much more than the daily newspaper or weekly magazine it's got to really be, in my case anyway, for me, I've got to think that this story is so darn important that I'm making a very big investment of it, and I'm believing that other people are going to see the worth. And that's a that's a lot to carry while you're not living on much money, and while you are having to work hard, and you just sustain yourself for quite a long time on the belief that this is worth it. And so for me, that's where I think that I am doing my bit for history for the moment. Also, I'm awfully glad that those three men are out of prison now, and I stay in touch with one of them, Jason. But the sense that there's something large here that makes it worth doing in terms of history. And I'll go back to saying that the the first book I mentioned about the two boys and the mom who had kept such good records, that happened in a county just south of where I live. And it involved a lot of political, I mean, all these stories involved the prosecutors, the courts, the police. And in this particular story, the two boys, the boys on the tracks is the name of that book. In that case, the prosecuting attorney ended up going to federal prison because he was running a drug racket out of his office as prosecutor. And the boys were killed as part of what is widely suspected some kind of drug thing that they wandered into. So here they are, murdered, and the prosecuting attorney, who's the head of the drug task force, does all kinds of grand jury hearings, but years and years go by, and he never can figure it out. The police can't figure it out. Nothing. And then, lo and behold, then finally, ultimately, years after he just practically goes nuts, the feds come in and take him out and say, yeah, you're running a racket here. So, but as I live here, I wrote that book. That book was published almost 20 some years ago. The number of people who come up to me and say, because it's closer to where I live, and say, thank you for writing that. Thank you, because we live in fear down there, and it has always been like that. There is a corruption at the heart of government there, and nobody dares even talk about it. So it has been very gratifying for those people, and of course there's wider interest as well, but especially for the people who really knew and know, and people who weren't even born at the time, but see it's still going on, to see that somebody talked about it. It was talked about. It was written about. It wasn't solved at all, but parts of it were exposed, and that alone, in the face of such heavy pressure, was important. So that's about what I'd say in terms of kind of the big deciding issues. Then you get down to what word to put next in the sentence, and is it one sentence or two sentences, and all of the really fine points. But for as far as the major kind of crossroads decisions of pursuing a long, in-depth story, that's what I came up with.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. That was. Oh, I'm getting an echo, but thank you very much. That was very helpful and informative.
No.
I'm going to unmute this if anyone has questions, or if you're just logged in online, you can type in a question here or email me at Stephanie@insideothernews.com, and I will get your question tomorrow as well. Let's see. Let's see if we have questions to start. Otherwise, I've received a few questions in advance that we can go with.
I had a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Mara. This actually happened on my birthday, and so I had always kind of followed this throughout the years. And we lived in Little Rock at the time, but we're from Memphis, and they're both close proximity, so it's always consistently on the news. But there are still so many people conflicted over this because, you know, Damien Eccles went to the football game and told people he did this, and people were concerned, like, who tells somebody they committed a brutal crime when in actuality they didn't? And even to this day, at almost 40 years old, he's still involved in witchcraft and all that, you know. And but I wanted to get your opinion on the when they released the boys, they did it under the they didn't what'd you say?
The Alford plea. It was called an Alford plea?
Right. The Alford plea, instead of letting them off. And I know that it was Jason that was already released, but he pled because he wanted for Damien to be released, even though he had already been released. Is that correct?
No, not exactly. No, the way it worked was Jason did not want, they were all in prison. And Jason did not want the state had kind of come to a fork in the road where there was evidence that was now going to lead to require the state to give them a new trial. And the state, the prosecutors, were afraid that if we give them a new trial, it might not turn out the way the first one did, because there had been a lot of questions asked in the meantime, and they might get off. And so that was a concern on the part of the state. On the other side, a concern that the lawyers for the guys had was, well, it could turn out the way it did the first time, and they could get the same sentences or worse even if there was a new trial. So everybody was kind of, and so two of the three, Damien and Jesse, the two older ones, said, if the state offers a deal to let us go if we just say we did it, we'll take that deal. Jason Baldwin, the youngest, said, no, I don't want to I don't want that deal. I will go to trial the second time, because he believed that if it went to a trial the second time, he would be acquitted, fully acquitted, innocent, and he didn't want to. He didn't want to do that, and so he said, "I'll stay in prison until they say, you know, this could mean you could stay in prison for a couple more years while this happens." He said, "I'll stay in prison. I want to have that trial." But then the lawyers for Damien and the lawyers for Jesse said, "Look, Damien is ill in prison. His vision is not good, and he had physical problems, and Jesse's father was old and believed Jesse just wanted to get back and see his dad again in case he died while he was still waiting in prison. They both wanted to be out right then, and so they went to Jason and said, "Look," and the state's position was, it's all or nothing. You all have to take the deal, or nobody gets the deal. And so the pressure was really put on Jason, and he decided that, well, I cannot stand by on my wishes at the expense of you guys, and especially since what was hanging over Damien's head was if he went to another trial, he stood the possibility of getting the death penalty again. And so it was a very tough position that Jason was put in, and he made a decision, I think, of kindness for the other two. But the expense for him was that he had to walk out of there. He had to stand up in court and say, I know that if I went to trial, that the state could possibly present evidence that would convict me. And so he walked out. He's a convicted child killer, as all three of them are now. And and the state of Arkansas seems to be satisfied, saying, oh yeah, they killed all those kids and we let them go. You know, it's crazy. But yeah, and Jason and Damien, I think, still is interested in the occult, and that's his right. He can do that.
Oh, Jason is, or Damien is?
Damien is.
Oh, right. But one of the questions I had personally was that the three boys may have had separate amounts of culpability. I didn't know if they were all three there at the same time, if they were all three involved on the same level, and things of that nature. And like you say, one of the boys was intellectually slow and may have just been caught up in being at the wrong place at the wrong time. And I wondered what your opinion was on that.
Personally, and this is just my personal opinion, but I don't think any of those boys was anywhere near the scene of the crime that night. And I say that based on this. Whoever killed the kids stuffed their bodies into the water, stuck them down in the water, in the mud under the creek, and stuck their clothes in the water and held them down, stuck them in with, like, almost stapling them down with twigs to hold their clothes, because the boys were naked, hold their clothes down there. Whoever did this got waist deep, at the very least, in that muddy water there. And the site is right by a freeway. And the kids lived, not one of those boys lived any closer than 4 miles from the site where the bodies were found. So that means that having done this, one or two or all three of them would have had to walk 4 miles, roughly, about, in 3 different directions to get to their houses, and then clean up and not be seen by anybody. There was only one claim of witnesses who said that they saw Damien, not muddy, not at all, not just but near the site there that night. But that claim was so wild and had so many problems with it that the prosecutors didn't even use it. And so virtually, actually, nobody saw any of these 3 muddy, bloody guys walking around in the middle of the night for miles in 3 different directions and could place them there. So I just don't buy it. But that's just my own personal deduction and conclusion from that. And then.
But what happened? What was the evidence against the stepfather?
Well, that's another part. That's another part of the story. Then, many years later, after we passed the DNA law in Arkansas in '98, that lets inmates who think that they have been convicted wrongly and that new science could exonerate them, they can ask to have it tested if they can find somebody to pay for it. Well, there were people willing to pay for this, for the DNA testing on this. What do you know? When that happens, and the guys all had to sign off. Yeah, I know that if it goes against me, it goes against me. If it shows that I was there, it shows that I was there. But they all signed off on it. the DNA that the police had tested, which was a couple of hairs, was among the few items that they had recovered from the scene. A couple of hairs turned out, one of the hairs found inside one of the knots of the shoelaces that were used to tie up one of the boys' hands, and inside that knot was a hair that was a DNA match for the stepfather of one of the other boys. And that has raised a lot of questions about the case. And it turns out that the another hair that was found in the bark of a tree near where the bodies were and collected was a very good friend of this stepfather who provided his alibi for that night, who said he was at his house. They were at the house together playing guitars the night of the murders. So here are two guys who were supposedly playing guitars the night of the murders, and what appeared to be their hairs at the crime scene. And the prosecuting attorney for that district, who was not the prosecutor of the original case, the current one, said that he doesn't find that convincing enough to do anything with, and there's been no reopening of the investigation, and everybody in Arkansas is standing firm with, we got the right guys originally, and don't need to do anything else. And so that's where it stands.
Wow.
We're gonna, yeah, thanks for the explanation on that. I know that a lot of people have questions about that case in particular, the West Memphis 3 case, Mara. So thanks for kind of giving an update on where it stands today. I know that's helpful. I know a lot of people have a lot of questions, and it's been a very complex case, and that's one of the reasons you've been covering it for so long. So that's good to know. We've got another question here from the chat. How do you get suspects to open up to you?
Suspects. well, with respect, you have to, I think, approach everyone with openness and respect, and I've also found that the more you know about them and about their lives and the case and everything that you can have done in advance, when you talk to a suspect, they'll go one of two ways. They either will just totally clam up, which of course that's the end of talking to you, but very often they are either convinced, and maybe rightly, that they shouldn't be a suspect, and you have to listen to that and hear what they have to say. Why is that? And that's very informative. And then at the same time, where you question it, if you ask reasonable questions, a lot of times they kind of bend over backwards to explain and defend themselves, and sometimes trip themselves in the process. And so I don't think that the usual police approach to interrogations or interviews, as they're called, is necessarily right. And in fact, there's been a lot of very interesting discussion going on now about the way police interviews are conducted, with that good cop, bad cop, or aggressive, or all these different styles. I think that the real straightforward, real direct, real honest approach on your part, and an openness and willingness to hear what they had to say, but also challenge what you're not understanding or what doesn't make sense to you, produces good stuff. And again, it may be one of those things where you say, "Whoa, you've convinced me," or else you may have more than you had to go on before you even got into it. So I think as with everybody that a reporter talks to, you start off with an attitude of respect.
Okay. Are there other questions? I've got some others here, if not. Okay. Mara, you mentioned a lot about, the importance of documents in the cases that you've covered. When the documents are unavailable for whatever reason, the people that you need to get documents from, either from the government or, whoever the local law enforcement body is that, you're trying to get information from, if that's not happening, what are your tips there? Has technology helped with the access to records, or what are your thoughts on that?
If it's a public record that you should be able to get, I say fight like hell. It's just the violations of public records laws, freedom of information laws, are I think that should be one of the commandments that we abide by as a lie. But so I just say you're ready to go to ground on records that are being withheld. I'm just at the end nearing the end of a really the hardest book I've ever written, and I'll tell you that I wrote requesting state police files that should be public from Arkansas State Police and the Louisiana State Police years ago on this same case, and this is another decades-long case that I've been doing. It goes back to when I wrote that first book about the boys on the tracks. Back then, that was in the 1990s, I filed federal Freedom of Information requests with the FBI for records about that case. And in that time, I was denied FBI, a million reasons why the feds couldn't turn over anything. And I finally went to my congressman and I said, this is going on, can you help me? He got denied. They wrote to him saying, oh no, couldn't possibly release those records. And he really went to bat for me, and 3 times he pushed it. By the 3rd time from a congressman, they released a big box of records on that one case to me. So I wrote one chapter that dealt with that in that book back then. Now, flash forward all these years, I've been asked to write this other book that goes deeper into that part of the story. And so I decided, okay, now I'm going to go back and get the Arkansas State Police, and since it involves Louisiana, I'm going to get some Louisiana State Police records too. I had records from both of those states from way back when. But now, all these years later, I'm told by both agencies, we don't have any records on that case. And I'm saying, no, you don't destroy police records. That's not supposed to happen. Well, in that case, in this situation, I went to the Arkansas Times, where I'm a contributing editor, and we had a threat of a lawsuit in Arkansas, gonna sue over it. There was a lot of intense back and forth, and only then did the state police say, okay, all right, we'll turn over some records for you. And they did. They turned over a little packet of records that maybe was a half an inch thick. And in that pack, I came back and compared it with state police records in my files from back then, where I had records myself that they were not giving me now, that I had gotten back then. And I have newspaper reports of other reporters back then seeing thousands of pages of records in the state police file on this case. But no. Now it was maybe 67, 70 pages at most. So and and Louisiana is stuck with its story that they just don't have any. They just don't have any records on this case. But I've got interviews with state police officers from back then that were published years ago talking about it. So I'm being lied to. I am just flat being lied to, and I've been denied important public records. And now that is part of the story. That is a major part of the story which involves a lot of cover-up. And part of the story now is that you would think 30 years later that this would not still be being covered up, but it's being covered up even more intensely now. And this recent experience with the records is evidence of that. So you do what you can.
Okay. And as you've become more experienced as a reporter, do you think that the access to people that you need has become easier, or has it become more difficult because they might know who you are as a reporter and know that you are going to stop at nothing to get records and to get interviews and the information that you need?
Well, yeah, it works both ways, as you could imagine. There are, for instance, right now I've had a request in to interview our governor about for this book, and he's not responding. And we go back years on this subject, and that's unfortunate. On the other hand, there are a lot of police officers who have been involved on the ground level with this story, and they know a lot. They know a lot really close to the scene, and they're talking to me. They know what happened. They know how they were treated and mistreated, and they're glad somebody's saying it. So, or not necessarily setting out to say that they were mistreated, but looking at what happened, because it wasn't right. And so it works both ways.
Okay. And we're going to wrap things up very quickly here. I know we're getting to the end of our time, and you've been very gracious with your time today. One other question that's very good. Have you ever been worried for your own personal safety when investigating these cases? I know that you cover a lot of gruesome trials.
Really, maybe no, I haven't. And the best reason is that I have been, because I've been reporting all along, and people know every step of the way. And starting when I was doing daily and then weekly reporting, I was reporting, and I was sort of getting the reputation. Well, she does this kind of thing, and so in a funny kind of way. And I know this is not true in a lot of places and for a lot of reporters. But for instance, we know about reporters who are killed and kidnapped in other countries in particular, and it's very dangerous what they do. For me, in my environment, I can say that the best protection I have had has been continuous reporting, so that, for instance, when I was the one where I was really warned was on that first book where about the boys on the tracks, where they never went to trial, and there was a lot of politics and cops involved and stuff, and people said be careful at every turn, and I was just warned, but at the same time I was continuously reporting things that I found out that were worth reporting. And so I always had in the back of my mind, who'd want to kill me? Because it would be so obvious.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you really wanted to draw attention to something worse even than what I was writing about, would be to do that. So I think that's been a big help.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, are there any other final questions from the audience? Okay. Well, I guess if we could end with you kind of telling what you're up to now. I know that you've spoken a lot about the book that you're currently working on, but is there anything else, when can we look for it and things like that?
Okay, thanks. Let me just say this has been very nice. It's a treat to be asked questions like this, and I I would, as to what I'm working on right now, the book is called The Mina File, and it refers literally to the file that I've been keeping on a very big mystery that's gone on in Arkansas for many years about the what went on at a little airport in western Arkansas called in the town of Mena, M-E-N-A, and and Tom Cruise is going to actually be starring in a movie called Mina on that very subject that's supposed to come out in early next year. And I think that my book, which will go into great detail about that, will be coming out at about the same time. So that's it.
Okay. All right, well, perfect. Well, thank you very much. For those of you who want to find out more information about Mara, you can visit her website, maraleveritt.com, MARALEVERITT.com. And if you'd like even further information, hopefully you have ordered your copy of In Other News, Reporters on Reporting, by myself, Stephanie Forshee, and Rosie Downey. And that is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And if you have any follow-up questions for me about the book, you can, or just about the webinar in general, or just to say hi, you can email me at stephanie@insideothernews.com. And with that, I thank all of you for attending. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Mara. We really appreciate it. All of the helpful tips, and yeah, hopefully we've got some future investigative reporters on the line right now who are going to follow in your footsteps.
Okay, well, good luck to everybody, and thank you, Stephanie.
Yep, thank you.